Okay, let's try and unpack this. Just imagine for a moment. It's spring 1945. The world is, well, it's on its knees after years of brutal war. And somewhere in a quiet corner of Germany, there's this prominent physician facing just an unimaginable decision. Does he kill his entire family? Or does he commit suicide alone? And this isn't just some grim thought experiment, It was the terrible reality for Helmut's father right at the very end of World War II, a moment that just captures the utter
There
collapse.
really is a heart-wrenching way to start. And what's so profound, I think, is how that deeply personal tragedy, that awful choice, it really illuminates the crushing weight of the whole era. It makes you ask, doesn't it?
Mhm.
How did a nation, how did society get to such a dark place? So our deep dive today, it isn't just about reciting facts. It's more about exploring Germany's journey. From the ruins of one war to, well, the horrors of the next. We use our sources to sort of guide us through the questions and answers to understand how Nazism rose and the devastating impact it had.
It's quite a story we're going to follow. And our mission really is to track that narrative thread. It's almost like solving a historical mystery in a way. We want to understand not just what happened, but the key turning points, the ideologies at play, and those societal shifts. Maybe subtle at first. That allowed it all to unfold and why it all still feels so relevant today. So the war finally ends, the fighting stops, and the world is left looking at just unimaginable atrocities. The immediate question, the overwhelming one, must have been how do you even begin to serve justice for suffering on this scale, for crimes that are almost beyond comprehension?
That was exactly the challenge. After Germany surrendered, the Second World War was over, and the Allies were faced with this. There was this unprecedented feeling that there had to be accountability. And that led directly to setting up the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which was quite something new. It wasn't just any court. It was really a landmark moment created specifically to prosecute individuals for what they defined as crimes against humanity. This really set a powerful precedent, that leaders could be held responsible on a global stage.
Right. And that term, crimes against humanity, it conjures up the sheer scale of the horror. Now, our sources are quite specific about who the Nazis targeted for mass murder, for that systematic extermination. Could you maybe elaborate on the groups highlighted? Why is that specific targeting important to understand?
Yes, and that distinction gets right to the core of Nazi ideology. The sources explicitly point to Jews, Gypsies, the Roma, and Sinti, and Polish civilians as the primary targets for mass murder. Now, others suffered terribly too, of course. French resistance fighters, for example, were victims of brutal repression, but they weren't listed in quite the same way in this context of mass genocidal targeting. These groups were targeted for annihilation based on their ethnicity or perceived race. Understanding that precision helps us see it wasn't just wartime chaos, but a calculated ideological campaign.
Okay, so to really understand how such an extreme regime could rise, how Germany could get to that point where someone like Helmut's father faced that dilemma, we need to go back further, right back to Germany after the First World War. The Weimar Republic is formed. It's supposed to be democratic, but it seems it wasn't well received right from the start. Why was that? What were the immediate problems?
Well, it was born into an almost impossible situation, really. The biggest problem was that it was forced to accept the incredibly harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles after Germany's defeat. This wasn't seen as a fair peace treaty. It was seen as a diktat, something imposed by the victors. So imagine trying to build a democracy when you're immediately blamed and burdened for losing the war. That sense of national humiliation, it poisoned the well from day one.
So Versailles wasn't just political humiliation, it was an economic disaster too. What were those key economic consequences? The debt, the
Well,
losses.
the economic terms were crippling. Germany was ordered to pay reparations amounting to £6 billion, a truly colossal sum back then. And on top of that, they lost significant territory, land rich in resources like iron and coal. Think about the Saar region, Alsace-Lorraine. This wasn't just a bill to pay, it was economic strangulation. It damaged their industry, hindered recovery, and made it incredibly hard for the government to provide for people.
And that combination, humiliation, economic hardship, it created this deep resentment. And a narrative formed, didn't it? What was that derogatory term used in sort of conservative nationalist circles for the Republic's supporters, branding them traitors?
They were called the November Criminals.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a very damaging term. It was aimed at the socialists, the Catholics, the Democrats, basically anyone who supported the new republic. The accusation was that they had stabbed Germany in the back by signing the armistice in November 1918 and accepting Versailles. It wasn't just name-calling. It was a powerful propaganda tool that really undermined trust in the new democratic government.
But the political scene in Berlin back then wasn't just about conservative anger. There was pressure from the other side, too. Revolutionary demands for Soviet-style governance. Which group was pushing for that?
That was the Spartacist League, a revolutionary uprising. Led by people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they were communists who wanted to establish a government like the Bolsheviks had in Russia. Their revolt in early 1919 showed just how fragile and volatile everything was. The new republic was squeezed between the far right hating democracy and the far left wanting a totally different revolution.
Okay, so immense political pressure from both sides. And then the economy just collapses again in 1923. The government starts printing money like crazy in response to the French occupying the Ruhr. What happened then? What was that economic term?
That was hyperinflation, an absolute economic nightmare. Money lost its value incredibly rapidly, almost hour by hour. We're not talking about just high prices. We're talking about needing a wheelbarrow of cash for bread, life savings becoming worthless overnight. It absolutely devastated the middle class, destroyed their savings, and fundamentally shook their faith in, well, everything. Money, the government, stability. It created immense despair.
Just as things maybe started to stabilize a tiny bit after that disaster, another huge blow comes from outside. Something happens globally in 1929 that plunges Germany back into depression. What was that?
That was the Wall Street crash in the USA. It triggered the Great Depression worldwide. And for Germany, it was particularly catastrophic because its recovery, such as it was, had become really dependent on American loans through the Dawes Plan to manage reparations and rebuilding. When those loans suddenly dried up after the crash, German industry just collapsed. Unemployment skyrocketed, reaching over 6 million people. Poverty became widespread again. It pushed an already fragile society right to the edge, making people desperate for any leader promising a way out.
Right. So we have economic chaos, political instability, this deep resentment simmering away. But were there also flaws within the Weimar Constitution itself, like actual structural weaknesses that made it vulnerable to, well, dictatorship?
Yes, absolutely. Despite its democratic ideals, the Constitution had, you could say, two critical weaknesses. First, proportional representation. It sounds fair, but in practice it led to lots of small parties in the Reichstag, making it really hard to form stable majority governments. Coalitions were weak, governments changed frequently, people lost faith. And second, maybe even more critical, was Article 48. This gave the president emergency powers to rule by decree, to suspend civil rights, and bypass parliament altogether. It was meant for emergencies, but it created a constitutional loophole, a pathway for authoritarian rule.
And that environment, the despair, the instability, these constitutional loopholes, it was perfect ground for extremist parties, wasn't it? How dramatically did support for the Nazi Party actually change in parliament between, say, 1928 and 1932?
The change was staggering, really alarming. In the 1928 election, the Nazis got just 2.6% of the vote, a tiny fringe party. By July 1932, they had surged to 37%. They became the largest party in the Reichstag by far. That leap tells you something profound about the mood in Germany. People were so desperate, so disillusioned, they were turning to radical solutions, even ones that threatened democracy itself.
And once Hitler did become chancellor in January 1933, he moved incredibly fast to dismantle democracy. What was one of the very first major steps he took? Using the Reichstag fire as a kind of excuse.
Yes, the Reichstag fire was the perfect pretext, whether they started it or just seized the opportunity. Almost immediately, Hitler persuaded President Hindenburg to issue the decree for the protection of people instead of the fire decree. And this decree suspended fundamental civil rights indefinitely. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, all gone. It was a critical step. It basically silenced opposition legally and created this atmosphere of fear. Dissent became dangerous.
But that wasn't the final nail in the coffin for the Republic, was it? There was one more act that gave Hitler total power.
That's right. The final decisive step was the Enabling Act, passed in March 1933. You could call this the legal death of German democracy. It essentially gave Hitler's cabinet the power to make laws without the Reichstag's approval for 4 years. It allowed Hitler to sideline parliament completely and rule by decree. This act established the dictatorship. The Weimar Republic was finished.
So power is consolidated. Now let's look at the ideology driving it all. What was the core Nazi belief about human equality? This twisted idea at the heart of it.
The absolute core of their ideology was the rejection of equality. They believed fiercely in a racial hierarchy. At the very top, they placed the so-called Nordic German Aryans. Everyone else was ranked below. Jews in particular were placed at the very bottom, considered subhuman or an enemy race. This idea of racial purity was fundamental to everything they did.
And this ideology wasn't just about controlling Germany internally, was it? It fueled their ambitions for expansion. What was that geopolitical concept, living space, that justified taking over new territories?
Lebensraum, yes, living space. This was central to Hitler's thinking. The idea was that the superior German master race needed more territory to thrive for population growth, for resources, for agriculture. And they looked primarily to Eastern Europe for this space. It inherently meant conquering, colonizing, and brutally displacing or enslaving the existing populations there. It directly led to the invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union.
And disturbingly, the horrors weren't only directed outwards or at minorities. Some Germans themselves were targeted. What was the euthanasia program? It sounds medical, but it was something else entirely.
It was chilling. The euthanasia program, codenamed Action T4, was Nazi racial ideology turned inward. Under this program, Germans who were considered mentally or physically disabled, people deemed unfit or life unworthy of life, were systematically murdered, often gassed. It wasn't about mercy. It was about cleansing the Aryan race, reducing costs to the state, and horrifyingly, it served as a kind of trial run for the mass killing methods later used in the death camps.
And the legal basis for separating and persecuting Jews was established quite early on. Those infamous Nuremberg laws from 1935. What were they designed to do specifically?
The Nuremberg laws were a watershed moment in the legal persecution of Jews. There were two main laws. One stripped Jews of their German citizenship, making them mere subjects of the state, stateless in their own homeland. The other, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, forbade marriage and even relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. These laws legally defined Jews as separate and inferior, isolated them, and laid the groundwork for all the discrimination and violence that followed. They gave state approval to prejudice.
And after these laws, the segregation became very visible. That requirement for Jews to wear the Yellow Star of David from 1941, what was its purpose?
The Yellow Star was a deliberate tool of humiliation and control. It was an identity mark they had to wear visibly at all times. Its purpose was clear: segregation and persecution. It made Jews instantly identifiable, isolated them from society, and made them easy targets for harassment, deportation, and violence. A constant, visible symbol of their exclusion.
The regime also used language in a very cynical, deceptive way, didn't they, to hide the reality of their crimes in official documents. What was the euphemism they used for mass killings?
They often use the term special treatments, Sonderbehandlung, in German. It's one of the most chilling examples of Nazi euphemisms. Using this bureaucratic, almost neutral-sounding term masked the reality of industrial-scale murder. It helped obscure the truth, perhaps even from some involved in the bureaucracy, making the unthinkable seem somehow mundane.
And these special treatments, these mass killings, where were they carried out? Which camp is specifically named as one of those killing centers?
Auschwitz. Auschwitz-Birkenau is explicitly mentioned, and it has become the most potent symbol of the Holocaust. It was one of the main extermination camps, designed specifically for mass murder, primarily through gassing. Millions were murdered there.
Shifting focus slightly, the Nazis knew they had to control the minds of the next generation to make their regime last. How did they use schools and textbooks to indoctrinate children?
They completely overhauled the education system. School textbooks were rewritten from top to bottom. History was distorted to glorify Germany and vilify enemies. Biology became racial science, promoting Aryan superiority. Even maths problems sometimes had ideological slants. The goal was to saturate young minds with Nazi ideas, justify their racial policies, and spread stereotypes, particularly about Jews, ensuring loyalty from a very young age.
And they had very specific roles for girls in this new order, part of what's called the Nazi cult of motherhood. What was their main job?
For girls, the primary role was clear and heavily emphasized: become good mothers. Their duty was to bear and raise racially pure Aryan children, maintain the purity of the race, stay home, and teach their children Nazi values. Motherhood was presented as a patriotic service to the state and the race.
And for boys, the indoctrination started very young, too, with mandatory youth groups.
Yes, from the age of 10, boys had to join the young folk, the junior section of the Hitler Youth. This wasn't like Scouts. It involved rigorous physical training, paramilitary drills, and constant ideological instruction, all designed to instill absolute loyalty to Hitler and prepare them for future service, likely in the military.
It's the question everyone asks. And facing all this systematic cruelty, how did most ordinary Germans react? Was there widespread resistance?
Or apathy? Well, according to Pastor Martin Niemöller, who was himself imprisoned for speaking out, the reaction of the majority was, sadly, passive, apathy, and fear. He described them as onlookers, witnesses who were too scared to act or protest. His famous poem about First They Came For captures that feeling of silence born from fear and perhaps gradual normalization of the unthinkable. The constant propaganda and the very real danger of opposing the regime created a climate where speaking out took immense courage.
While many inside Germany were silent, there were voices from outside pleading for peace, right? Even appealing directly to Hitler.
That's true. Mahatma Gandhi actually wrote letters to Adolf Hitler. Gandhi, the apostle of nonviolence, appealed to Hitler to stop the war, to choose a path away from violence. It's quite a striking image, isn't it? That appeal for peace directed at the heart of the war machine, a testament to a different possibility even then.
So, wrapping this up, what does it all mean? We've covered so much ground here, tracing this path from a struggling republic after one war to the absolute horror of a regime that committed genocide and plunged the world into another conflict. We've seen the economic despair, the political failures, the constitutional flaws, how it all tragically came together.
Exactly. And if we connect it all, the story of Nazi Germany is just such a stark, essential lesson. It shows what can happen when democracy fails, when propaganda runs rampant, when prejudice isn't challenged. It really underscores why critical thinking is so important, why we need the courage to question things, and why we must actively defend democratic values. The descent can be gradual, almost imperceptible at first.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, as difficult as the subject matter is, it really leaves us with some profound questions, doesn't it? About power, about democracy's fragility, and about our own individual responsibilities when we see injustice. So, the question for you listening now is, what lessons do you take away from this history about protecting our shared humanity today? And maybe more importantly, how can we recognize those early warning signs, those first steps down a similar path in our own times? Something to really think about.